Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the inaugural episode of Cinema Nippon, a study in Japanese film. And what better way to kick things off than with the work that introduced Japanese film to a lot of Westerners? No, it's not something from Kurosawa, nor Ozu, nor Mizoguchi, nor Oshima. Today, we're talking about Battle Royale. Whether it's from exposure due to the backlash and claims of plagiarism against the Hunger Games, or because you read the manga or the novel, or because you were an early adopter who ordered a Region Zero bootleg of the film straight from Hong Kong after seeing a 60-second trailer you downloaded via dial-up way back at the turn of the millennium, you've probably heard this name at least once before.
In much the same way, you likely feel as though you've heard this whole spiel before. That's because, if you're a longtime viewer of Cinema Nippon, you'll recall that our very first episode concerned the masterfully controversial cult classic, Battle Royale. Due to a frivolous copyright claim, that video got booted from the channel early on, with a backup hosted on the now defunct VidMe. We figured with the approach of our 2-year anniversary, what better way to celebrate how far we've come in 24 months, and what better way to show our appreciation for everyone who has helped and supported the channel than to remake that original episode. Better, faster, stronger, and more packed with goodies and insight. So join us today as we look into Battle Royale and its sequel, Battle Royale II Requiem, on the 2nd anniversary special of Cinema Nippon.
This odd couple of notable films initially sprung from the pages of a book by a newcomer to the literature scene, a book which proved quite controversial upon release, foretelling the challenges these two films would later encounter. The novel Battle Royale was written by Koushun Takami, a journalist born in 1979 around Osaka, and raised in Kagawa Prefecture. In the 1990s, Takami worked as a journalist for the Shikoku Shimbun, serving the 4 prefectures of Shikoku Island. He left his job towards the end of the decade when he penned the novel and submitted it to a literary contest. Battle Royale was then summarily expelled from the competition due to its extreme content. As they say, there's no such thing as bad press, and the publicity garnered from this expulsion led to the book's publication in 1999. An English translation by Yuji Oniki and published by Viz followed in 2003. The initial translation has been criticized for being somewhat unnatural and awkward, and as such, an updated English translation by Nathan Collins arrived in 2014. Before we get too far ahead, however, let's run the tape back to 1999, when the novel was just hitting store shelves in Japan, causing a sensation in its own right.
Enter Kinji Fukasaku, born July 3, 1930, an influence on many, from Quentin Tarantino to John Woo. As we've thoroughly discussed on this channel, relatively early in his career, Fukasaku revolutionized the yakuza genre with his massive series Battles Without Honor or Humanity and its sequel trilogy. Both earlier and later in his career, he was known to work in varied territory, like science fiction, manga films, even an adaptation of a stage play by Yukio Mishima, which was in turn an adaptation of an Edogawa Rampo novel. What we're getting at here is that, besides the battles and the Doberman cops of his career that our show up to now might lead you to believe were Fukasaku's bread and butter, we've actually only focused on a small portion of what he was capable of. Fukasaku was a fearless director, being something of a precursor to Takashi Miike, both being men who would work on anything as long as it piqued their interest. Thus, it should be no surprise that in 2000, when Fukasaku was a wizened director of 70, he put to celluloid perhaps the most youthful film, featuring a cast of nearly 50 teenagers. Of course, the teens aren't the only big stars here.
A decade prior, Fukasaku was slated to direct 1989's Violent Cop, starring Beat Takeshi, which would have served as something of a return to form for Fukasaku's gangster efforts. Unfortunately, Fukasaku had to pull out at the last minute due to scheduling conflicts. At the time, Kitano was hosting a variety show, and the shooting schedule for the show could not be broken for one extended period as Fukasaku had asked. As a result, Fukasaku had to resign in favor of other projects, not being interested in Violent Cop without Kitano. This, in turn, led Kitano to take over the film, making Violent Cop his directorial debut. As we've discussed to a lesser extent in earlier episodes, Takeshi Kitano had an equally diverse and storied past when paralleled with Fukasaku's own. Born January 18, 1947, Kitano entered Meiji University to study engineering in 1965. After dropping out in 1970, he worked odd jobs before becoming a stand-up comic, Beat Takeshi, part of 2 Beats, with his counterpart Beat Kiyoshi. 2 Beats became very popular in Japan, leading to more entertainment opportunities for Kitano, which led him to entering the film industry as an actor in the 80s.
After breaking off from 2 Beats and establishing himself as primarily an actor and a director, Kitano had a serious motor scooter accident in 1994, leaving the right side of his face paralyzed. He took up painting and produced Hanabi, the film which won Kitano international acclaim and supposedly led to his being taken seriously as a director in his home country, where previously his directorial projects were seen as vain side projects of an actor. It seemed for the better part of a decade that Fukasaku and Kitano were fated to continue on their separate paths throughout the world of filmmaking. This changed, however, when Fukasaku snagged the film rights for Battle Royale and needed an emotionally charged performance from a stoic older man who would portray the sadistic, disenchanted teacher of the class.
Filming began on Battle Royale with an estimated $4.5 million budget. The film's cast was chock full of newcomers by virtue of the actors' ages, with Kitano and Fukasaku taking the roles as the heavy hitters at the head of the film's bill. Filming took place partially in Tokyo, but mostly on Hachijo-kojima, a volcanic island neighboring Hachijojima, itself a popular tourist area about 50 minutes flight from Tokyo. The main island was promoted after World War II by the government as the Hawaii of Japan. Kojima, on the other hand, is an abandoned island now inhabited by feral goats, with a population that once peaked at 513 residents, but which by 1950 had fallen to 55. One might wonder why it's abandoned. Well, by 1969, the last residents had left, citing a lack of utilities, schools, and healthcare. This might have spelled bad news for the residents, but for the purposes of filming a bloody battle royale on an abandoned island from which the students had no hope of escape, yeah, it was kinda perfect.
The film itself concerns a program set up by the Japanese government to curb misconduct among children. How did the dystopian overlords deal with misbehavior in schools? Why, they set up a lottery system in which one class from Japan is randomly selected each year to participate in an all-out battle. In this competition, winner takes all, meaning that only one student is allowed to survive. What's more, restrictions are placed on the area in which the students can operate, meaning that everyone cannot simply hide out for the duration of the event and survive this way.
That being said, the nearly 50 students have 3 days to kill one another. Several times a day, different areas of the island become danger zones, meaning that if the participants linger in these areas, they will be killed immediately. This is guaranteed by the explosive collars with which each student is equipped. These collars also ensure that no one may escape the boundaries of the game. What's more, each student begins the event with a survival pack containing water, feminine products for the girls, and most importantly, a weapon. The weapons range from highly effective and dangerous to more or less non-lethal, meaning that the game is much more luck-based as it is concerned with the students' individual skills.
Without giving anything away plot-wise, that's basically the long and short of the film. We follow an ensemble cast, spending most of our time with a pair known as Shuya and Noriko, who act as the audience proxy. This couple provides the largest amount of morale questioning towards the ills of the world, as well as the game in which they're being forced to participate. Some of these actors came from acting backgrounds, and some went on to do some pretty major things later in their careers. Regardless, it's from the diversity of their experiences and reactions to the Battle Royale that the film derives most of its emotional impact, as well as, perhaps, a bit of its staying power.
Even if you can't connect with Shuya or Noriko, at least one of the others will likely strike a chord with you. Shogo, the loner who has good left in his heart, Shinji and his cohorts, the group who have the brains to try and outwit the whole program together rather than resorting to killing other students, Hiroki, the boy whose youthful folly of pining after a girl even in these desperate times proves detrimental to himself and to others. The list goes on and on. There's so much depth of character going on within Battle Royale, in spite of everyone's relatively little screen time, that it makes one wonder how Fukasaku was able to pull something like this off, creating arguably one of his opuses so late in his life and career. The truth behind that may be darker than one would expect, as it relates to Fukasaku's own personal experiences growing up in 20th century Japan.
Being that he was born in 1930, Fukasaku was too young to see active duty in Japan's latest military conflict to date. However, given that Japan had entered a state of total war in the 1940s, it was expected that all citizens would do their part for the war efforts. Thus, as a boy barely in his teens, his class was made to work in a munitions factory, where they experienced the horrors of war. Upon reading Koushun Takami's source material for the film, something felt authentic to him about the carnage described and the government seen in the novel, which is admittedly more openly totalitarian than Fukasaku's own vision in the film. When discussing his adaptation of the novel, Fukasaku was quoted as saying,
quote, "I immediately identified with the 9th graders in the novel, Battle Royale. I was 15 when World War II came to an end. By then, my class had been drafted and was working in a munitions factory. In July 1945, we were caught up in artillery fire. Up until then, the attacks had been air raids, and you had a chance of escaping from those. But with artillery, there was no way out. It was impossible to run or hide from the shells that rained down. We survived by diving for cover under our friends. After the attacks, my class had to dispose of the corpses. It was the first time in my life I'd seen so many dead bodies. As I lifted severed arms and legs, I had a fundamental awakening. Everything we'd been taught in school about how Japan was fighting the war to win world peace was a pack of lies. Adults could not be trusted. The emotions I experienced then, an irrational hatred for the unseen forces that drove us into those circumstances, a poisonous hostility towards adults, and a gentle sentimentality for my friends, were a starting point for everything since. This is why, when I hear reports about recent outbreaks of teenage violence and crimes, I cannot easily judge or dismiss them. This is the point of departure for all my films. Lots of people die in my films. They die terrible deaths. But I make them this way because I don't believe anyone would ever love or trust the films I make any other way. Battle Royale, my 60th film, returns irrevocably to my own adolescence. I had a great deal of fun working with the 42 teenagers making this film, even though it recalled my own teenage battleground." End quote.
As you can hopefully see in Fukasaku's own words, Battle Royale spoke to a very personal part of his own history, in which he, at the age of the characters, witnessed sights akin to those in the film. He felt that this was an important film for him to make, sort of like Nobuhiko Obayashi saying that he wished to explain the atomic bomb to children through his 1970 film House. Given the vastly different tones and reception of these two films, though, you can see that where Obayashi sought to use children-like imagery and language to explain these horrors to children, Fukasaku instead wanted to bear his own experience to a generation so far removed from those dark days 60 years prior.
The film developed a cult following, particularly among school-aged children, which one could argue either way whether it helped or hindered Fukasaku's goal. Were the audience members horrified and clutched by shock, or were they idolizing the violence? Not everyone saw eye to eye with Fukasaku on this, however. In particular, he received a major amount of pushback from the generation between him and his audience, those leading the country at the time.
The Japanese Diet, Japan's parliamentary body, was skeptical of the film even before its release. The Diet, not usually a body to interfere with films' ratings, but spurred on by controversy over the film's subject matter, requested that the film's rating board, AIDIN, give Battle Royale a more restrictive rating than it eventually received. Nobutaka Machimura, the contemporary education minister, asked that the film be toned down in terms of violence. Koki Ishii, the opposition leader, suggested that the filmmakers were stirring controversy to draw moviegoers. Quote, "This film is rubbish. It turns murder into a game. I see lots of movies, but this is the worst, lowest level one of any I've seen." End quote. Kaoru Sugita, Toei's publicist, stated, quote, "Since they started rocking the boat, there's been enormous publicity and many more people now want to see it." End quote.
Just like with Takami's novel a year prior, those who sought to shut the film down served only to bring more fresh eyes to Fukasaku's work. Fukasaku himself said in an interview that he takes no responsibility for people committing violent action, as violence in media can be a purifying force given the quote-unquote growing aggression of modern society. While Fukasaku wasn't pleased with the idea that people the age of the characters couldn't see the film, he also seemed resigned to the fate, worrying that further pressing may lead to heavier restrictions on film censorship at large. Perhaps he recognized his age was catching up with him, and he hoped to help push boundaries for the benefit of younger filmmakers, rather than have the censors push back and leave the scene worse than it started. Fukasaku, a one-time president of Japan's Directors Guild, had a duty to his fellow artists. He knew he didn't want to hurt future artists and inadvertently place more restrictions on their film output. However, this didn't stop Fukasaku's questioning of authority within the film proper.
The most prominent example of Fukasaku's distrust of authority at large, besides of course the overbearing totalitarian regime looming in the background of the film, is his inclusion of the bomb-making magazine used by Miura in the film. Hara Hara Tokei, or The Ticking Clock, was a real manual written by the East Asia Anti-Japan Front, a group which posited that anyone expressing Japanese nationalism, or even complacency with nationalism, was complicit with totalitarianism. The group existed from 1970 to 1975 and committed several bombings in that time, after which 7 key members were arrested. Most notorious was the 1974 bombing of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which killed 8 and injured 380. Hara Hara Tokei was published in March 1974, detailing the group's ideology as well as guerrilla tactics for bomb creation and blending in with society as a revolutionary, the latter of which is important for the film's plot. This inclusion likely went over the heads of the younger audience members, but it helps hammer home the importance of not blindly believing in one's superiors. Instead, Fukasaku's message within the film definitely seems to be that young people ought to gather as much knowledge as possible and to discern their own paths in life, a sentiment also driven home by the end card for the film, inciting the audience to never stop running, no matter where they're headed.
While the film was met with much controversy and criticism upon release, it didn't do too shabby at the box office. Battle Royale grossed 3.11 billion yen domestically, making it a hit, and the third highest grossing domestic film from December 2000 to November 2001, behind only Spirited Away and Pokémon Forever. International distribution, meanwhile, was just as rocky as the pre-release hype within Japan. Contrary to long-standing rumor, the film was never officially banned in the United States. As far as can be discerned substantially and beyond mere rumor, Toei seemed to be asking $1 to $2 million for distribution rights in the US. This was too much for small distributors, which Toei didn't want in the first place. As Premiere Magazine reported, Toei wanted a large release, like the then-recent US release of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. The distributor reportedly wanted Battle Royale to open on 300 screens across the country, which, given its subject matter and the recency of the Columbine High School shooting, likely wasn't on the table.
Besides, American commentators argued that, were the film cut for an MPAA-savvy R rating, there would be nothing left to screen, and that a foreign release of Battle Royale's content simply could not endure nor profit from such a relatively wide release. Strangely, when Toei was contacted by fans of the film interested in purchasing the rights for American distribution, Hideyuki Baba, the manager in charge of international sales and distribution at Toei, was quoted as saying that the film was being withheld from North American distribution due to Battle Royale's, quote, contents and theme, end quote, in spite of purportedly being approached by multiple distributors, including big studios. That being said, whether it was a question of release size or themes, the film was not officially obtainable in the US for a decade, with most American fans resorting to bootlegs or Korean DVDs in the meantime. In 2010, Anchor Bay finally picked up both halves of the franchise for American distribution.
The film was met with renewed controversy, though for once on the opposing side of the fight, when in 2012, the first in the tetralogy of Hunger Games films was released. The Hunger Games adaptation brought greater attention to the trilogy of books that had preceded it, and rekindled the argument from many fervent Battle Royale fans about importing the film rather than seemingly remaking it. We say rekindled because there was some controversy among fans earlier in the 2000s, when it was announced that an American remake of the film may have been in the works. Of course, this never came to fruition, so the ire of Battle Royale fans fell in turn to the Hunger Games. By 2012, Battle Royale's place in the canon of cult horror and Japanese film had been so cemented that a number of American fans questioned the merits of retelling the same story over and over, just set in new settings.
Let's be honest though, this basic story for both projects goes way back, having served as the basis for a number of other stories. Just to name a few, The Most Dangerous Game, The Running Man, The Long Walk, Rage, Lord of the Flies. If anything, the Hunger Games franchise resembles Battle Royale II more than Battle Royale. In the light of the controversy over alleged plagiarism, something the author of the Hunger Games books denies vehemently, the executive director of marketing at Anchor Bay spoke on the release of the single-disc edition of Battle Royale in America. They stated, quote, "Our release strategy is extremely focused around the anticipation for the Hunger Games, especially for the single-disc release. The DVD artwork focuses on 2 characters with weapons, similar to some of the Hunger Games' key art." End quote. So even if those on the Hunger Games side of the argument wanted to deny any similarities, the American distributors for Battle Royale knew how to play contemporary trends in order to sell the film to a whole new audience.
Outside of controversy, Battle Royale was also an extremely well-received film within its home country, critically that is, upon release. This helps us understand the polarizing nature of the project, and why it's still relevant almost 20 years later. In terms of accolades, Battle Royale was nominated for 9 Japanese Academy Awards, including Best Film, Director, Actor, Screenplay, Score, Sound, Newcomer, Popularity, and Editing. Unfortunately, the film only won a few of these. The Editing Award for Hirohito Abe, 2 of that year's Newcomer Awards for Tatsuya Fujiwara and Aki Maeda, and the General Popularity Award. This makes sense when you consider what the film was up against. It lost notably in the categories of Best Film and Best Screenplay to After the Rain, which swept 8 of its own 13 nominations. After the Rain was adapted from one of Akira Kurosawa's final scripts, and directed by Takashi Koizumi, his assistant director of nearly 3 decades. So we're talking about a controversial, violent film about children having to kill one another, going toe-to-toe with one of the lingering projects of one of the nation's most beloved filmmakers. Quite literally ever. Released within a mere 2 years of his death. Yeah, like we said, it's easy to see why Battle Royale didn't quite muster up the support to topple After the Rain.
Clearly, Battle Royale spoke to something within the youth and the general population of Japan upon its release. Sure, the controversy helped to promote it, but in order for it to maintain the level of popularity that it has throughout the years, there needed to be something more under the surface. In particular, the film was a hit with younger viewers, which makes sense when you consider what the children endure in the film, as well as the world in which the viewers were living in the early 2000s.
You might notice that throughout the movie, the children are constantly driven by the influence of parents or guardians, but that all of the adults are ineffectual. Even Kitano, the adult at the center of the entire game, is an ineffectual parent who can't be present for his daughter when she needs him. He's too focused on his job, that of maintaining the game, and he can't come home, nor can he even speak with his daughter in her times of need. He is selfish, just as Shuya's father is portrayed, as well as, to an extent, Minami's uncle. Perhaps these representations of ineffectual adults spoke to the viewers, which can be explained by the social conditions bridging the decades between 1945 and 2000.
You see, after World War II and a period of Reconstruction, Japan entered an era from the 60s through the 80s known as the economic miracle, in which the nation saw an unprecedented economic boom. Unfortunately, what goes up must come down. When the bubble economy that built up into the late 80s burst, it caused large amounts of unemployment, even greater than that seen at the end of the war. Throughout the 1990s, many adults were laid off and found themselves in situations not unlike those of the adults in Battle Royale. Shuya's father is portrayed as an unemployed deadbeat, though it could be argued he is instead a victim of circumstance. For these reasons, the 1990s were known as the Lost Decade due to the longevity of the effects resulting from the economic crash. Thus, Battle Royale was arriving at the end of this lost decade. As Takami and Fukasaku would have no way of knowing though, this period didn't end at the year 2000. It was instead renamed the Lost 20 Years thanks to the fact that the effects continued well into the 2000s, unintentionally situating Battle Royale in the center of this dark time.
Coinciding with all this unemployment and economic strife, youth violence was on the rise in the late 90s and early 2000s within Japan. At the time, school children were becoming stressed and expressing their aggressions outwardly. If you consider how Akira dealt with perceptions of youth violence and gangs in the 70s and 80s, and transposed it into the late 90s, you've got the basic idea. Some adults blamed video games and media, as we saw in our Ichi the Killer episode, while others said it was children becoming spoiled due to coddling throughout their youth, a sentiment many of our younger American viewers will probably recognize. Kitano's character seems perhaps inspired by this attitude towards children, which was prevalent at the time. In this way, we can likely deduce that Fukasaku didn't agree with this sentiment, given how impotent and ultimately tragic he makes Kitano look. This is not a well-adjusted adult, but rather a man left out in the cold, looking for someone on which to blame his problems.
Regardless of Fukasaku's take on adults like this, there were several notable cases of youth violence at the time, which likely both spoke to the sentiments of Battle Royale and contributed to the film's controversy. In a notable case from 1997, a 14-year-old boy who now writes under the pseudonym Seito Sakakibara decapitated and placed the head of a schoolmate before his junior high gates. He also admitted to the killing of Ayaka Yamashita, a 10-year-old, 2 months prior to killing the 14-year-old boy. Due to the nature of the killings and the taunting notes addressed to the police, the nation expected to find an adult killer and was shocked to learn the young age of the perpetrator.
In response to rising youth violent crime rates, the Juvenile Law of 1947, which had set the standards for the prosecution of minors, was in 2000 edited to lower the age of adult prosecution. As we explained in our video on confessions, juveniles are tried in family court as opposed to criminal court. The age of adult criminality was 20 in the original law, with some exceptions being made for major cases over the years. The change, which wasn't the first in the law's history, lowered the age from 16 to 14. Cases like that of Sakakibara killing his 2 classmates no doubt contributed to these changes, which in turn spoke to general sentiments regarding child violence at the time.
Something else you might not know about Japan that contributed to these tensions between underemployed adults and violent youth came in the form of school tuition. At the time of Battle Royale's release, parents had to pay for their children's high school tuition, creating a massive financial burden, especially in the post-bubble-burst economy. A 1998 survey of teachers at a union workshop showed that 24% were experiencing gakyo hokai, or collapsed classrooms, meaning they had lost control of their classes. In the 1980s, this issue had yet to be given a name, showing that it didn't become a serious issue until the 1990s. In 1998, physical attacks on teachers by students rose by 20%, showing that the issue of gakyo hokai had reached new heights, at least in some schools.
Beginning in 2010, the Japanese government began providing subsidies for school tuition, allowing children to attend high school without the need for financial worry. There are still large supplemental costs for public, private, and cram schools, as well as admission and exam fees, but the year-to-year tuition is better covered nowadays. Returning to what we mentioned previously, these changes would indicate that Battle Royale came at just the right time for maximum impact, at the lowest point, so to speak, for all of these conditions.
With one success, there is often likely to be a follow-up. It should be no surprise that once the first film wrapped, development on a sequel was not far off. However, neither the novel nor the manga adaptation had any sort of continuation at the time. All aspects of the franchise had their own quirks and differences, but they were all relatively self-contained. Fukasaku stood alone in this regard, having a design for continuing the story which others had felt was wrapped up properly. Thus, 3 years later, a sequel, Battle Royale II: Requiem, was released to the public. The story connecting the 2 films is a bit more tragic than one might expect, however.
Requiem picks up several years after the conclusion of the first film, and casts the film's universe in a much different light. The differences here are honestly astounding, making the 2 films seem like night and day. Understandably, this has led to a love-it-or-hate-it affair for most viewers, with the majority of critics and fans alike seeming to tend toward the latter option. A brief explanation of the film's setup should help add context to this.
In Requiem, we're treated to a whopping 2 returning characters amongst a cast of dozens more. The game is afoot once more, though the government of Japan has even darker designs for this year's installment. Rather than battling it out with one another in a deserted area, the selected class is tasked with laying siege to a compound controlled by Shuya Nanahara. Apparently, Shuya has become so influential with the youth of the nation that he has mounted a full-on rebellion. Sequestered in an island fortress with his guerrilla army of teenagers and preteens, Shuya's war on all adults has gotten the attention of Japanese leaders. You can likely already see the cracks forming in this narrative, given just how ridiculous and childish a premise this is. Rather than learning from the events of the first film, Shuya has decided that it's not people who are corrupt, but rather adults, leaving his child soldier compatriots as pure in his eyes.
Things only grow more outlandish with the introduction of this year's Game Master, an equally childish teacher played by Riki Takeuchi. Viewers of the show and fans of yakuza cinema from the 90s will recognize Takeuchi as one half of the madcap powerhouse who starred in the Dead or Alive trilogy. Takeuchi's demented portrayal here is something to both marvel and gawk at, being as off-balance and bizarre as Shuya's character shift.
Thus, we end up with a strange frame for the story, while the main narrative itself concerns Shiori Kitano, the daughter of the first film's Game Master. Remember how Kitano never had time for his daughter and was constantly blowing her off? Well, the man was still her father, and Shiori is here, hellbent on exacting revenge upon the boy who took his life. Thus, Shiori provides the film's true emotional punch, leading us to the big questions of the film. She goes in expecting to be the one to take Shuya's head, not for the glory of destroying a terrorist, but for her own personal reasons. However, when Shuya realizes the siege is not perpetrated by adults, but rather children dressed as soldiers, he extends an olive branch to those left alive. This leaves Shiori uncertain how to proceed and morally conflicted upon realizing that while he might be a terrorist, Shuya is just a kid, and a kid who has himself been wronged. What's more, Shiori's flashback scenes with Kitano provide a nice emotional backbone to the whole series, tying both films together.
It's at this point that one would likely ask why the two films ended up so different from one another. That's both easily explained and hard to accept. Just before shooting began on Requiem, Kinji Fukasaku went public with the fact that he had prostate cancer. Several months later, once only the flashback scenes with Kitano had been put to film, Fukasaku passed away at the age of 72. The show had to go on, however, and his son, Kenta Fukasaku, then barely over 30, took up the mantle. Kenta completed the film, though he would go on to state in interviews that he didn't see this as his directorial debut, as it is often listed. Rather, he said that he merely saw it as him completing his father's final film.
This tragedy left a mark on the film that makes one wonder how the original product might have turned out were Kinji Fukasaku to have completed it himself. The film's writing credits belong to Kenta and Norio Kida, which tells us that Kinji's personal spin likely wasn't in the script to begin with. However, it's easy to ask whether the strange tonal shift between the films is the fault of the writing or of Kenta's directing. Kenta did go on record in 2003 to tell Time magazine that he saw the film as, quote, an alternative to what he sees as the moral certainty of American culture, end quote. Kenta seemed to believe that in combating American cinema, what couldn't be surmounted in terms of budget could be overcome with hard-hitting themes and questionable morals. In some ways, it's a commendable effort. As Kenta explained in the same interview, quote, we never set out to make Harry Potter. The point is to make people think about big issues. I want the audience to try and see the world from a terrorist's point of view. End quote.
While the film has not been kindly received in most cases, we can't say for sure that these portions of the film are a total failure. It might be rough around the edges, whether due to the writing, the novice directing, or the frankly outlandish performances from the leads, but there's certainly some gold to be found if we sift deep enough. Similar to the preceding film, the public didn't take kindly to Requiem either. To be fair, this wasn't entirely the fault of this film, however. Many politicians and concerned parties seemed to sort of ignore it. After all, the first film came out and didn't set the nation on fire the way some were acting like it might. Culturally it might have, but not literally. Requiem did decently at the box office, but sadly it seemed pretty certain from the start that this would be the end of the franchise, at least as far as the Fukasakus were concerned. Still, one final event added new controversy, reigniting the upset from the franchise.
In 2004, an 11-year-old girl killed a classmate by the name of Satomi Mitarai with a paper cutter. The perpetrator was known only to the public as Girl A due to regulations regarding the identities of underage criminals. Girl A cited Mitarai's negative comments online regarding her appearance as the catalyst for her attack. More of interest for Battle Royale fans and critics alike, though, was Girl A's obsession with the bloody tale. Reportedly, Girl A was a fan of the novel, Battle Royale, leading to further scrutiny of the original film. This wasn't helped by the fact that she wrote and posted Battle Royale fanfic on her site, providing irrefutable evidence of a link. Supposedly, the studio behind the second film postponed the release of Requiem on DVD following this incident, either out of respect for the victim or out of fear of retribution. What's more, uncensored photos of Girl A leaked online, leading to her becoming an early 2000s meme under the name Nevada-tan, thanks to her choice of clothing in her most notorious photograph. Supposedly, similar to the murderer mentioned earlier in this episode, Girl A may have been identified at this point, given that she was a minor at the time and would have been released by now. Either way, her status as a meme has continued for more than a decade, leading to examples of fan art and cosplay, with Nevada-tan garnering her own fandom online.
Regardless of this event, until the aforementioned American controversy regarding the Hunger Games, Battle Royale seemed to avoid many headlines from 2004 onward. The films and franchise as a whole have at this point cemented themselves in the canon of Japanese film, as well as horror and cult cinema globally. In the English reissuing of the novel, Koushun Takami penned an essay where he questioned his status as an author. In almost 20 years, he's never produced another book, instead having his writing career defined by Battle Royale solely. For younger generations of moviegoers, at least outside of Japan, the same could be said of what the first film did for Kinji Fukasaku. In the perspective of his career at large, it was both a new type of experimentation, as well as a return to form in terms of its hyperviolence and heavy political themes. And yet, for those not interested in yakuza cinema, it's one of the only films bearing this legendary director's name to enter the popular conscience.
In much the same way, Battle Royale was our personal introduction to Fukasaku as well as to Japanese cinema at large. We owe a lot to this first film for this reason. In fact, we could easily argue that Battle Royale is one of the two films that led us to beginning this show in the first place. The other film in question is a story for another day. Regardless of personal feelings between Battle Royale and Requiem, we highly recommend checking out both films. The first is required viewing for anyone interested in turn-of-the-century Japanese cinema, while the second is a case study in just how off the rails such a sure thing can go. One day, we'll hopefully get back to talking about Kenta Fukasaku in his own right, rather than under the tutelage of his father. For the time being, though, this video has gone on long enough.
Thank you everyone for your support these past 2 years. This episode may have originally served as our pilot, but in remaking it, we've realized how much our studies have taught us. It was only appropriate to return to the project that started it all to pay reverence to Battle Royale, Kinji Fukasaku, and to every one of you who has come along on the journey with us. It's been a wild, long, fulfilling ride so far, but as they say, it's only just getting started. Stay tuned, dear viewers, as the next 2 years are shaping up to be even more fun than the first 2.